big data-driven innovative solutions with states who lack necessary resources. Member states need to be agile, forward-thinking, and introduce comprehensive legislations to address this issue. Upholding human rights in practice and procedures, along with understanding the gendered impacts and biases of new technologies, are crucial. Ongoing dialogue with multi-sectoral partners and sustained state efforts would be required to successfully create a bulwark against use of new technologies for terrorist purposes. This is why our partnerships with the private sector, CTED's Global Research Network, and civil society, some of whom are present here today, are crucial in acquiring the latest evidence-based research, industry updates, and programmatic insights. The outcome document, which will be adopted today at the closing of the session, suggests several key measures and principles we can all endorse. Together, we can harness the promise of emerging technologies for the original purpose it was intended for, to accelerate global progress for the benefit of humankind. Let me conclude by saying that the threat of terrorism is grave and universal and continues to grow in several parts of the world, particularly in several parts of Africa and South Asia. Terrorism in any part of the world is a threat to the peace and security for the whole world. And therefore, it is important we reaffirm that all acts of terrorism are criminal and unjustifiable, regardless of motivation and wherever, whenever, and by whomsoever it is committed. Thank you. I'm now pleased to invite Dr. Jaishankar, External Affairs Minister, Government of India, to deliver the keynote address. Sir, you have the floor.
Madam Chair, Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. At the outset, let me extend a warm welcome to all of you who have traveled from every corner of the globe for making it convenient to attend the special meeting of the Counter-Terrorism Committee of the UN Security Council. This is the first time that the UN Security Council is holding a meeting in any format in India. That it is doing so when we are celebrating the 75th anniversary of our independence, the Azadi Ka Amrit Mahotsav, is especially noteworthy. I thank the members of the committee and the Counter-Terrorism Executive Directorate for their efforts in holding this special meeting in India. I would also like to acknowledge His Excellency Antonio Guterres, UN Secretary General, for his remarks that were read out just now by Ambassador. Your presence here in Delhi today for this special meeting of the CTC demonstrates the importance that the UNSC members, member states, and a wide range of stakeholders place on this critical and emerging facet of terrorism. That the Council is holding this special meeting of its Counter-Terrorism Committee in India is also a product of the fact that counter-terrorism has become one of the top priorities during our ongoing tenure in the Security Council. Terrorism remains one of the gravest threats to humanity. The UN Security Council, in the past 2 decades, has evolved an important architecture built primarily around the counter-terrorism sanctions regime to combat this menace. This has been very effective in putting those countries on notice that had turned terrorism into a state-funded enterprise. Despite this, the threat of terrorism is only growing and expanding, particularly in Asia and Africa, as successive reports of the 1267 Sanctions Committee monitoring reports have highlighted. The technological innovations and breakthroughs of the past 2 decades have been transformative in the way the world functions in every respect. These new emerging technologies, from virtual private networks and encrypted messaging services to blockchain and virtual currencies, offer a very promising future for a wide array of economic and social benefits for humankind. However, there is a flip side, especially where terrorism is concerned. These very technologies have also thrown up new challenges for governments and regulatory bodies due to their potential vulnerability for misuse by non-state actors, given the very nature of some of these technologies and the nascent regulatory environment. In recent years, terrorist groups, their ideological fellow travelers, particularly in open and liberal societies, and lone wolf attackers have significantly enhanced their capabilities by gaining access to these technologies. They use technology and money, and most importantly, the ethos of open societies to attack freedom, tolerance, and progress. Internet and social media platforms have turned into potent instruments in the toolkit of terrorists and militant groups for spreading propaganda, radicalization, and conspiracy theories aimed at destabilizing societies. Another add-on to the existing worries for governments around the world is the use of unmanned aerial systems by terrorist groups and organized criminal networks. Being a relatively low-cost option with an increasing ease of accessibility, misuse of these unmanned aerial platforms for nefarious purposes by terrorist groups, such as weapons and explosives delivery and targeted attacks, have become an imminent danger. They are therefore a challenge for security agencies worldwide. The possibilities of using weaponized drones for terrorist purposes against strategic infrastructure and commercial assets call for serious attention by member states. Our own experience of the 2008 Mumbai attacks, and you will all recall the briefing yesterday, our experience showed us how a benign technology of Voice over Internet Protocol, VoIP, could be used for organizing and directing such a barbaric terrorist attack from beyond our borders. More recently, these terrorist groups have been using unmanned aerial platforms such as drones and quadcopters for cross-border trafficking of drugs and arms and for carrying out terrorist attacks. And such risks are not limited to India. In Africa, drones have been used by terrorist groups to monitor movements of security forces and even of UN peacekeepers, making them vulnerable to terrorist attacks. A few months ago, terrorists launched cross-border drone attacks on the UAE and Saudi Arabia, targeting civilians and civilian infrastructure, which led to loss of lives and injuries, including to Indian nationals there. India has strongly condemned these cross-border drone attacks both in UAE and Saudi Arabia. With this context, we felt an urgency to initiate a focused discussion at this preeminent Security Council organ, the Counter-Terrorism Committee, charged with the purpose of combating terrorism on this evolving threat from misuse of new and emerging technologies. In January last year, while addressing the Security Council on the issue of terrorism, I had called for the need for the international community to adopt an 8-point action plan, which remains relevant in the context of today's meeting as well. One of the key points I had advocated was for member states to increase funding for UN organs such as the UN Office of Counter-Terrorism, the UNOCT. We have with us Ambassador Vladimir Voronkov, Under-Secretary General for Counter-Terrorism. Excellency, I am happy to announce that India will be making a voluntary contribution of $500,000 in the UN Trust Fund for Counterterrorism this year to augment the efforts of UNOCT in providing capacity building support to member states in preventing and countering the threat of terrorism. I would like to conclude by reaffirming India's commitment to strengthen international efforts to combat terrorism, including combating the use of new and emerging technologies. The Delhi Declaration, which is to be adopted at the special meeting of the CTC, will exemplify the commitment of the international community in dealing with the threat of use of new and emerging technologies for terrorist purposes. We are honored to host this special meeting of the Counter-Terrorism Committee in India and contributing to international efforts in this regard. I'm confident that today's special meeting will be yet another milestone for this Council to deal with a pressing issue which requires the urgent attention of the international community. I thank you.
I thank His Excellency Dr. Jaishankar for his remarks, and I am pleased to invite His Excellency Mr. Michael Moussa Adamo, Minister of Foreign Affairs of the Republic of Gabon, to deliver his opening remarks. Excellency, you have the floor.
Madam Chair, Honorable Minister, dear colleagues, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. Terrorism is constantly evolving and continues to pose a global threat more than ever. It endangers international peace and security, destroys societies, and destabilizes entire regions. Terrorism is an affront to common values enshrined in the Charter of the United Nations, and no country is immune. New technologies, including social media, encrypted communication tools, and cryptocurrency, are being used to the purpose of propaganda, radicalization of new recruits, and launch of atrocities. Since the military defeat of the Islamic State in Iraq and the Levant, ISIL in Iraq and Syria in 2017, foreign terrorist fighters have been on the move. Terrorism has become a transnational threat that no government or organization can combat alone. To that end, multilateral concerted action at national, regional, and global level is essential. Our action must be as swift and multidimensional as the threat itself and based on the principles of multilateralism. Esteemed colleagues, on the African continent, the terrorist threat is growing, diversifying, and has been modernizing over the years, trapping entire regions such as Sahel and the Horn of Africa in a spiral of inextricable complexity. The approach of highlighting the nexus of peace, governance, and development seems to be the most appropriate to break the cycle of abrupt political transitions and cyclical insecurity. We should adapt our response with coherency to the changing face of terrorism with great urgency. Indeed, the fragmentation of responses fuels the interest of terrorist groups that exploit systemic flaws to ferment the breeding ground for violence. Today, several regions of the continent are becoming sanctuaries for terrorist groups, epicenter of international insecurity, with one of the fastest growing humanitarian crises affecting the lives of millions of people. The humanitarian crises are becoming more complex with the induced effects of climate change, correlated with the rise of violent extremism. Poverty and inequalities inherent of recurrent political and social economic crises. The range of challenges facing the Sahel and the Horn of Africa, to which we must respond as quickly as possible, requires an urgent recognition of policies and approaches, and built on better coordination a more assiduous and stronger mobilization of the international community. For Gabon, the joint efforts of the United Nations and the African Union, combined with the active involvement of the countries of the region and sub-regional organizations, must rely on local communities. They are the ones who suffer on a daily basis of the assault of terrorism groups. Our efforts can hardly have a lasting impact without a consistent enhancement of local strategies based on commitment of women, young people, and the most vulnerable population, and of the mechanism of prevention, resolution, and consolidation of regional and sub-regional organizations. Development, governance, and security policies must go hand in hand with an absolute determination to defend the values of social cohesion and prohibition of hate speech, with a view to maximizing the impact of our efforts to promote lasting peace and stability in the region. Addressing these underlying causes of crisis means overcoming ignorance through quality education and addressing the lack of basic services and infrastructure to lift younger generation out of violent extremism. The commitment of the international community in fragile region must be commensurated with the threat scale. Indeed, it only takes one weak link for the entire chain of collective security to be shaken. Therefore, it is crucial for the international community to support the efforts of fragile states in the fight against terrorism with adequate logistical and material means, while acting decisively to emaciate the sources of financing of terrorist groups, which, with inter alia, profit from the illicit trafficking of natural resources in order to restrict their ability to feed themselves and their abominable activities. Gabon will welcome and support the document that will be adopted at the end of this session. En remerciant le gouvernement de l'Inde pour avoir pris l'initiative de cette importante rencontre qui intervient à un moment propice, je saisis cette occasion pour aussi exprimer à l'Inde, au gouvernement de l'Inde et à la population indienne et au peuple de l'Inde les chaleureuses félicitations de mon pays, le Gabon, pour son mandat exemplaire à la tête du comité 1373 contre le terrorisme. La tenue de cette réunion est un sujet aussi sensible qu'épineux concernant la cybersécurité et l'utilisation potentielle des technologies émergentes à des fins terroristes. Ceci illustre l'attachement de votre gouvernement aux efforts de lutte contre la menace terroriste. Il faut se féliciter du fait que cette réunion mette accent sur trois aspects essentiels, à savoir l'utilisation de l'Internet et des médias sociaux à des fins terroristes, le financement du terrorisme, l'usage des systèmes aériens sans pilote. Madame le Président de séance, chers collègues, Excellences, Mesdames et Messieurs, le terrorisme continue de poser une grave menace à la paix et à la sécurité internationale. Les organisations terroristes et leurs sponsors tirent profit de la faiblesse structurelle qui affecte un certain nombre de pays, notamment ceux faisant face à des conflits armés. Plus grave encore, ces acteurs sont constamment à la recherche de nouveaux instruments pour répandre la terreur, y compris en détournant les nouvelles technologies de l'information, l'intelligence artificielle et les systèmes aériens sans pilote à des fins terroristes. Cette situation pose un défi majeur à la communauté internationale, défi que nous devons tous relever sans tarder, tout en célébrant l'avènement des nouvelles technologies à de pointe, susceptibles de transformer la vie des populations, y compris dans les pays en développement. Notre monde aujourd'hui fait face au risque grandissant que ces nouveaux instruments qui sont le fruit du génie humain tombent entre les mains des groupes terroristes et organisations criminelles pour semer plus de violence et de désolation à nos communautés. Excellences, Mesdames et Messieurs, les actes terroristes perpétrés par des organisations telles que Al-Shabaab et Daesh ne sont pas seulement une atteinte à la vie et à la dignité humaine, mais ils constituent aussi et surtout une négation de la civilisation et ne sauraient donc être justifiés. Aucune cause, aucune idéologie, aucune religion ne peut servir de prétexte aux atrocités perpétrées par des groupes terroristes à travers le monde. Ce qui est frappant, c'est la capacité de ces mouvances à rester actives et à se renouveler, y compris par leur attitude à mobiliser des considérables sommes d'argent par des réseaux criminels, ce qui leur permet de recruter et de se propager en ayant pour cible principale la jeunesse désœuvrée. Une lutte efficace contre ce fléau exige donc une approche holistique et un traitement approprié des défis qui se posent, y compris sur le plan socio-économique. C'est ici le lieu de se féliciter des efforts remarquablement déployés par l'architecture des Nations Unies dans le cadre de la stratégie antiterroriste mondiale, y compris les comités de sanctions contre les groupes terroristes et extrémistes violents et les personnes et entités associées. Il nous faudra en outre renforcer le cadre normatif par une adhésion plus forte aux instruments déjà en vigueur, y compris la Convention de Budapest, mais également en accélérant nos délibérations en vue d'une convention globale contre le terrorisme. Mesdames et messieurs, c'est dans cet effort, nous ne ferons l'économie d'aucun moyen. Nous devons veiller scrupuleusement à une adéquation de notre réponse avec le droit international et les droits de l'homme, conformément aux résolutions 1624 de 2005 et 2617 de 2022. Face aux défis posés par l'émergence de nouvelles technologies, le Gabon, mon pays, appelle de tous ses vœux le renforcement des capacités des pays en voie de développement, notamment par la formation des cadres et l'apprentissage constant pour les préparer à être à l'avant-garde des technologies de pointe et de déjouer les velléités violentes des organisations terroristes. Il est absolument vital que les pays en développement puissent bénéficier d'une assistance technique qui tienne compte des besoins spécifiques et des menaces identifiées à l'échelle nationale et sous-régionale. Un accent particulier doit être mis sur la coopération internationale, notamment le partage de l'information et l'échange des renseignements entre les services de l'État et le secteur privé, y compris les entreprises du secteur informatique, les sociétés de transport maritime et les compagnies aériennes. J'aimerais conclure mon propos, insister sur 2 points cardinaux. D'abord, que le terrorisme ne doit et ne devrait être associé à aucune religion ou culture, ethnie ou civilisation. Ensuite, rappeler que notre action commune contre le terrorisme doit être en phase avec nos engagements en matière de respect des droits de l'homme, de la lutte contre la pauvreté, en accordant une attention toute particulière aux causes et à ces causes profondes, en mettant un accent particulier à l'éducation des jeunes et à l'amélioration des conditions de vie des populations les plus vulnérables. C'est dans cet esprit que le Gabon, mon pays, s'engage à appuyer la déclaration qui sera adoptée à l'issue de cette réunion spéciale. And I thank you for your kind and generous attention. Thank you.
I thank His Excellency, Mr. Michael Musa Adamo, for his remarks, and I am now pleased to invite Her Excellency, Ms. Shirley Ayoka Bochwe, Minister for Foreign Affairs and Regional Integration of Ghana, to deliver her opening remarks. Madam Minister, you have the floor.
Madam Chair, colleague ministers, excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. Let me begin by thanking the government and people of India for the warm reception and hospitality accorded my delegation since our arrival in incredible India. India has been a leader in the fight against international terrorism, and we commend her commitment to international peace and security. In this connection, we wish to thank the Government of India and the Counter-Terrorism Executive Directorate, CTED, for organizing this special meeting on countering the use of new and emerging technologies for terrorist purposes. We welcome your remarks, Minister Jaishankar, and we are convinced that today's meeting will help strengthen international efforts, including through new forms of cooperation on the countering the use of new and emerging technologies for terrorist purposes. Ghana will be committed to the outcomes of this meeting. Following the horrific 11 September attack, the Security Council swiftly adopted Resolution 1373. The resolution signaled the unity of the international community for the fight against terrorism. The subsequent establishment of the Counter-Terrorism Committee of the Security Council and the adoption of several resolutions and conventions on the subject showed the common commitment to combat terrorism in all its forms and manifestations. Despite international and regional efforts to fight the menace of terrorism, however, we have seen in recent years a growing trend in terrorist activity and expansion through franchising across regions and an attendant increase in violence and control of territory. These, together with changing, protracted, and complex nature of terrorism and the absence of any mechanism in the Security Council to deal with terrorist groups, pose dire consequences for international peace and security. In Africa, the threat situation has undergone significant evolution, culminating in the emergence of terrorism and violent extremism as the most threat undermining our peace, stability, and territorial integrity of many of our member states. According to the Global Terrorism Index 2022, Africa emerged as the global epicenter of terrorism last year, accounting for 48% of global terrorism deaths, with the Sahel becoming home to the world's fastest growing and most deadly terrorist groups. There is no doubt about the consequential impact of this development on our lives, our livelihoods, and our ability to realize the Sustainable Development Goals. Madam Chair, today's meeting therefore offers a unique opportunity to explore effective and comprehensive mechanisms to address the evolving phenomenon of terrorism. The complexity of violent extremism and terrorist crimes across the globe defies generalization and a one-size-fits-all approach. Response must therefore be robust and appropriate. Against this backdrop, I wish to highlight the following points from my government's point of view. First, in the light of the emerging trends and technologies being leveraged for terrorist purposes, it is imperative to adopt tailored measures to counter terrorism financing. Terrorist financing is essential to the operations of terrorist organizations, to maintain their networks, to recruit, and to acquire and supply arms and the new technologies. We must find ways to dry up external and internal financing of terrorists, including curtailing the increasing use of cryptocurrency, which is becoming a choice for financing terrorist activities. This requires, among others, genuine partnerships with regional institutions such as the Intergovernmental Action Group Against Money Laundering in West Africa. We must equally pay attention to the growing link between terrorists on land and pirates at sea, particularly in the Gulf of Guinea, as we work collaboratively to dry up their sources of funding and check any expansion of their operations. In this regard, we call for effective implementation of Resolution 2634 on maritime security in the Gulf of Guinea. Second, the unprecedented innovation in technologies and the challenges in regulation, licensing, and export controls have increased the ability of non-state actors and malign forces to secure products, including on the open market, and weaponize them. There's growing evidence of drones being weaponized by violent extremists and terrorist groups for surveillance as part of their intelligence and reconnaissance operations, or as explosive devices, as in the case of the attacks on Abu Dhabi. We need both global cooperation and national actions to thwart the acquisition of such technologies and their components by individuals or groups for terrorist purposes. Third, we are equally concerned about the growing misuse of the internet and social media by terrorists. While many of the benefits of internet and social media are obvious, it is being used by terrorist groups, especially in the dark net, to facilitate communication within terrorist groups, transmit material support, planned acts of terrorism for recruitment purposes, financing, propaganda, training, and incitement to commit acts of terrorism. We should therefore seize the opportunity provided in the ongoing negotiations to elaborate a global convention on countering the use of ICT for criminal purposes. Excellencies, in conclusion, Ghana urges action to ensure that states have access to all available tools for counterterrorism while effectively denying terrorists the means to threaten global peace and security with emerging technologies. We are determined to support the efforts of the Counterterrorism Committee of the United Nations accordingly. Thank you for your attention.
I thank Her Excellency, Ms. Shirley Ayoka Botchway, for her remarks, and I now invite His Excellency, Mr. James Cleverly, Secretary of State for Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Affairs of the United Kingdom, to deliver his remarks. Excellency, you have the floor.
Madam Chairman, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, may I start by thanking India, our hosts, and Dr. Jaishankar for his keynote speech. And you're right that countries must do more nationally and internationally to counter the threat of terrorism. The UN and an effective CTC both have a significant role to play in this endeavour. Just outside my office in London is an elegant memorial to those who were killed in the Bali bombing of 2002. 202 victims that came from more than 20 countries, including 23 from the United Kingdom. When terrorists struck in London in 2005, one of the 52 people they murdered was 37-year-old Neetu Jain, a biochemist graduate who was born in Delhi. And the victims of the 2008 Mumbai attacks, who we honoured yesterday, came from every continent. Terrorism is a global problem and a global threat. So I'm incredibly grateful for Foreign Minister Jaishankar for using India's Security Council presidency to focus on this crucial issue and advance his 8-point plan. The UK's partnership with India is hugely important to me, and I'm pleased to be taking forward our CT cooperation this weekend. But let me now turn to the technological advances which offer terrorists new opportunities that we must counteract. Within the space of just 2 decades, terrorists have gone from circulating crackly voice recordings from the depths of Tora Bora to global online recruitment and incitement campaigns, to live stream attacks. And online incitement and radicalization of vulnerable people in far-off countries, who have then gone on to use simple rental vans as weapons of terror. So we must continue to work together to fight terrorist ideologies online. In 2015, we set up the Counter-Daesh Communications Cell in London in partnership with the United States of America and the government of the United Arab Emirates. Together, we have worked with governments, civil society, and communities to challenge Daesh's narrative. And we're also working with the G7 and Global Internet Forum to counter terrorism. And we continue to press tech companies, amongst whom are some of the Internet's biggest players, to crack down even harder on extremist content online. Technologies that advance the online world also powers the real world, but both are open to exploitation. Tech designed with the best of intentions can be repurposed for the worst of aims. From a garden, from our ambassador's garden in Abu Dhabi, in January of this year, I saw the UAE's air defense system interdict Houthi missiles. And only a few weeks earlier, drones had killed 3 people in Abu Dhabi. Drones are being used currently to target critical national infrastructure and civilian targets in Russia's brutal invasion of Ukraine. So from the UAE to Ukraine, unmanned aerial systems, from relatively cheap and unsophisticated to those of military specifications, are used to inflict terror, death, and destruction. This is why we have sanctioned 3 Iranian military commanders and 1 Iranian company involved in the supply of drones, and why we must also do more to stop these technologies getting into terrorists' hands. In 2019, the UK government launched our counter unmanned aircraft strategy, and we are funding new counter-drone technologies. And we're working through the Global Counter-Terrorism Forum to ensure that we do more to stop terrorists from misusing drones. The internet has also given terrorist groups murky new routes to conceal their finances that they need to sustain their activities. We work with industry and international partners to understand and disrupt terrorist finances, including in Somalia and North Africa. We have made tackling illicit finance a core pillar of our cooperation with international partners like the UAE. And we look forward to India's No Money for Terrorism conference in November. This is vital work. The threat from terrorism has not gone away. We know a repressive response will only exacerbate the problem. And if we are to keep our people safe, we must comply with human rights. And we must continue to work together and with industry and all parts of our communities to discredit the narratives of hate, to counter radicalization, to infiltrate networks, to foil plots, and to starve terrorists of the finances and the emerging technologies that they would use to do us harm. Thank you.
I thank His Excellency, Mr. James Cleverly, for his remarks. I'm pleased to invite Her Excellency, Ms. Reem Ibrahim Al-Hashimi, Minister of State for International Cooperation of the United Arab Emirates, to deliver her remarks. Excellency, you have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. At the outset, the UAE would like to begin by thanking India in her capacity as the current chair of the Counterterrorism Committee and Minister Jaishankar for organizing and hosting us for this very special meeting. We deeply value your leadership on counterterrorism at the UN Security Council and beyond, and as the next chair of the Counterterrorism Committee in 2023, the UAE looks forward to building on your achievements. I'd also like to begin by paying tribute to all the victims and the survivors of terrorism. Yesterday's memorial ceremony in Mumbai was an important and very poignant reminder of the utter injustice of all the lives that have been cut short or forever altered by the scourge of terrorism. We owe it to all those victims to galvanize our efforts and improve international responses and end this global threat. Terrorism knows no borders, and though different parts of the world may become fertile breeding ground, that threat can still transcend anywhere at any time, as we have seen earlier this year in my country, but as is also evident in many of the countries and communities represented here today. New technologies can bolster efforts in areas ranging from the countering of terrorism to the development of early warning systems and predictive analysis, and the strengthening of surveillance capabilities. New technologies are also today involved in the delivery of humanitarian assistance. And as we've heard earlier, sometimes positive intent can actually be manipulated. How to stay ahead of these threats requires us to embrace innovation, but also be very open to new and different approaches and perspectives. And so let me take you on an imaginary journey into the near future. It's 2027, 5 years from now, and in a very heavily populated area, people are going about their daily lives, buying groceries at an open-air market, until they hear the buzzing noises and look up, and there's a swarm of 50 small drones appearing in the sky, several explosions, and more than 60 people killed in a matter of minutes. Among these victims are government officials who were meeting leaders of the local community, and the drones were equipped with cameras and facial recognition technology. These explosions not only killed those targets, but also indiscriminately killed many bystanders, men, women, and children alike. The terrorists weaponized the drone swarm with improvised explosive devices and were directing it from somewhere abroad using a smartphone. Everything that you needed for this attack was commercially available online. This scenario may seem like it's far-fetched, but it's actually alarmingly close to becoming a reality. Ongoing advancements in digital technologies are multiplying the possibilities of what devices like drones are able to do. One thing is clear: our existing regulatory systems and our policy discussions are not advancing at the same pace or at the same ambition as these threats that we all face. Technology is becoming a force multiplier of terrorism on our watch. Let me briefly touch on 3 issues that will be addressed during the special meeting and that are very pertinent in the minds of the United Arab Emirates leadership. First, terrorist groups are exploiting advances in commercial drone technology to carry out deadlier and stealthier attacks. Drones can now fly faster, travel further, carry larger payloads, and leverage artificial intelligence and other tools to operate without manual control. Advanced drone technology enhances the capacity of terrorists to conduct reconnaissance and target civilians with devastating attacks, including across state borders, while the projection of sophisticated capabilities is exploited for propaganda, very sophisticated propaganda, and recruitment purposes. This is a cross-regional challenge from Al-Shabaab in East Africa to Daesh and the Houthi terrorist group in the Middle East. It is urgent that we catch up to the reality of their deployment, including all transnational threats, and address these issues head-on. Second, the internet must not be a terror enabler. We've been having this discussion for years. Aren't you tired of these discussions? Despite the efforts of technology companies in developing detection tools based on artificial intelligence and human moderation, these are simply not enough. Extremist content remains on the internet with algorithms that promote the search for new audiences, making terror activity so appealing. hate speech, terrorist narratives, extremist language, disinformation, misinformation campaigns continue to undermine and break down our social fabric. We must find ways to fast-track efforts and strengthen regulatory and legislative frameworks to protect users, our communities, and our children. Third, curbing terrorism financing requires adjusting to the emergence of new financial instruments. Whether cryptocurrency or prepaid cards, a diversified set of payment options continue to fuel terrorist activities worldwide, and organized crime groups and their actors continue to find loopholes. With the rapid development of financial technology, staying ahead of the curve and properly addressing these risks becomes ever more difficult but ever more necessary. The UAE is fully committed to implementing AML-CFT regulations and has advanced the entire architecture of that framework to close the gaps in our system. And finally, it remains absolutely imperative for all of us to continue to keep our efforts united and to work diligently together to tackle the root causes of all forms of extremism in order to ensure that transnational malign phenomena ceases to metastasize. I believe we all agree on the urgency to tackle this challenge and political will remains present, but it is now important to prioritize action. Thank you so much for your time and attention.
I thank Her Excellency Ms. Reem Ibrahim Al-Hashibi for her remarks, and I'm now pleased to invite Her Excellency Ms. Meggy Fino, Deputy Minister for Europe and Foreign Affairs, Republic of Albania, to deliver her remarks. You have the floor, Excellency.
Thank you, Madam Chair, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. At the outset, please allow me to extend my gratitude to the Government of India for hosting us in this beautiful country of yours and for organizing these 2 days meetings of solidarity and providing the opportunity to express our joint commitment in countering terrorism, which is still a serious and imminent threat to international peace and security. Please also allow me to pay tribute to the victims of the Mumbai terror attacks and to all the victims of terrorism all over the world and express my deepest condolences to their families. As was mentioned these past 2 days and remains very much true, their suffering must not be forgotten. Dear colleagues, in the same vein, I would like to provide you with some brief information on what we have done in my country, in Albania, as we have focused in countering violent extremism, preventing recruitment and radicalization that leads to terrorism as a vital investment to peace and security. As an active participant of the global coalition to defeat Daesh ISIS, the Albanian government has taken concrete steps to build the legal framework and operational capacity to prevent and combat terrorism and the phenomenon of foreign terrorist fighters. Our policy is guided by the respect for human rights, effective law enforcement, and full international cooperation. Although in the country we have not experienced terrorist acts, it's important to note what was mentioned yesterday in the remarks by the victims and their families, but also reiterated today, that terrorism can happen to anyone, anywhere, as it knows no borders. That is why this requires joint action. In Albania, we have faced the phenomenon of foreign terrorist fighters, citizens going to conflict areas, at times even with their families, women and children, facing the horrors of war there. Repatriation has come to the forefront of the discussion, and in particular, ways on how to address repatriation in compliance with international standards and obligations. For that reason, we fully support international efforts that ensure prosecution of the FTFs, the protection, repatriation, rehabilitation, and reintegration of their family members, especially women and children. Let's not forget, many of them are victims of terrorism themselves, misled by a violent ideology and fed by illiteracy. Excellencies, Over the course of more than 20 years of war on terror, experts have identified political and socioeconomic conditions as root causes of terrorism. Technological enablers that make terrorism possible have been less studied. This meeting serves to reflect on recent developments and the latest evidence-based studies regarding the threats posed by the use of new technologies for terrorist purposes. Regrettably, violent extremists and terrorist groups use communication technologies to mobilize resources, train, radicalize, and recruit others to join their networks, in particular, youth. Some have become extremely skillful in exploiting the internet, video editing, social media, and other communication tools and means. We should not restrict our focus to countering the malicious uses of new technologies by terrorist organizations, but we must also learn how to use these technologies proactively. By doing so, the aim is to prevent the movement of terrorists, build capacities, and encourage good practices in information sharing. Experience shows that effectiveness of such measures is directly linked to the level of cooperation and coordination among government agencies, civil society, and the private sector, in particular the tech sector. We need to carefully address the terrorist threat while respecting human rights and fundamental freedoms in their entirety. Privacy rights and freedom of expression need to be respected and maintained, and a gender-sensitive approach should ensure that gender-specific concerns are also considered. Albania will continue to strongly support international cooperation and the promotion of UN standards and the practical implementation of the UN Global Counterterrorism Strategy through the prism of the new technological developments. And as a non-permanent member of the UN Security Council, we will maintain an active role in addressing this issue in the highest organ of the UN for a more peaceful and safer place for the present and also incoming generations. I thank you for your kind attention.
I thank Her Excellency, Ms. Meggy Fino, for her remarks. I'm pleased to invite His Excellency, Ambassador Eduardo Paes Saboya, Secretary for Asia, Pacific and Russia at the Ministry of Foreign Affairs of Brazil, to deliver his remarks. Excellency, you have the floor.
Madam Chair, Honorable Minister, Excellencies, distinguished delegates, I would like to thank the Government of India and the Counter-Terrorist Committee, Executive Directorate, for their efforts in organizing this important meeting, and also for the hospitality of India. I would like to convey Minister Carlos França's greeting to Minister Dr. Jaishankar, who has recently had a very productive and successful visit to Brazil. While new and emerging technologies can create opportunities for economic growth, they may also have unintended consequences. They surely offer us instruments for fighting terrorism, yet in the wrong hands, they may also enhance the ability to cause harm. This special meeting of the CTC is above all about the challenges in the use of technologies that can enable progress or yield destruction. When it comes to terrorism and the very graphic, raw devastation it provokes, which we saw in the videos here, this discussion is particularly pressing. This debate, to be successful, must involve all actors, especially those who may have a prominent role in counterterrorism. Therefore, it is positive to have such an inclusive participation today with representatives from government, civil society, academia, and the private sector. On the one hand, the development of ICTs, artificial intelligence, and other technologies can provide a wide array of tools to counter terrorism. They make it easier to identify suspects and confirm their identity with facial recognition software, ascertain behavioral standards, and analyze evidence. Remote sensing applications benefit from IA technologies to strengthen border management and control, and thereby reducing risks of cross-border movement of terrorists. On the other hand, there is justified criticism about impacts on the right to privacy and civil liberties. It is also known that flaws in the development of artificial intelligence and facial recognition software have regrettably replicated prejudices, not only making counterterrorism less effective, but also raising serious human rights concerns. The key to addressing these challenges lies in sound regulatory processes, which in turn require inclusive participation and a comprehensive debate. In Brazil, we had the opportunity to extensively examine how to respond to concerns of this nature in the discussions that led to the adoption of the Brazilian Civil Rights Framework for the Internet and the General Law on the Protection of Personal Data. In light of the rapid pace of technological innovation, we will probably be required to constantly update our legal frameworks and the methods of work of our intelligence and law enforcement national organs. It is crucial for our governments to be able to rise to increasing new challenges posed by the use of new and emerging technologies by terrorist groups. In this process, we must always bear in mind that counterterrorism can only be really successful if conducted in full compliance with international law, including the UN Charter, international humanitarian law, international human rights law, and international refugee law. Given the transnational nature of the threat, we must also intensify international cooperation among member states, international and regional organizations, and stronger cooperation will allow us to further exchange information and best practices and foster more initiatives of capacity building in benefit of national institutions. The absence of an internationally agreed upon definition of terrorism undermines the effectiveness and cohesion of global, regional, and national efforts in the fight against the phenomenon. Moreover, the lack of a universal conceptual framework creates the risk of the application of double standards. Therefore, we should continue to aim at the adoption of a comprehensive convention on international terrorism. The repudiation of terrorism is a principle enshrined in the Brazilian Constitution. Terrorism is unacceptable in all its forms and manifestations. It undermines the rule of law and thus international peace and security. This special meeting and the discussions we will have today can help strengthen our collective response to this threat. It demonstrates that we can take advantage of new and emerging technologies in our favor in order to counter their misuse by terrorist groups. It also illustrates our resolve to combat terrorism within the strict limits of international law, aware as we are that otherwise counterterrorism action would defeat its own purpose of saving lives and inhibiting violent extremism conducive to terrorism. Thank you.
I thank the Ambassador for his remarks, and I will give the floor now to Mr. Vladimir Voronkov, Under-Secretary General for the United Nations Office of Counter-Terrorism, to deliver his remarks. You have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Excellencies, Ministers, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for the invitation to address the Security Council Counter-Terrorism Committee and for convening this special meeting to consider the important theme of countering the use of new and emerging technologies for terrorism purposes. Mr. Minister, thank you very much for your announcement about the next generous contribution to our voluntary budget. Much appreciated. Thank you very much. I also very grateful to the Government of India for warm hospitality. Thank you again. I also thank Mr. Wei Sheng Chen and his colleagues in the Counter-Terrorism Committee Executive Directorate for the close cooperation with the United Nations Office of Counterterrorism and excellent organization of this meeting. The role of new and emerging technologies in fundamentally transforming all facets of our lives is beyond question. They have proven their value as indispensable tool for advancing peace and security, sustainable development, and human rights. However, terrorists often misuse and abuse these technologies to advance their agendas, thereby undermining international peace and security. As I briefed on behalf of the Secretary General of the Security Council in August, Daesh, for example, has significantly increased its use of unmanned aerial systems in northern Iraq during the past year. Terrorists are increasingly utilizing information and communications technologies, in particular the internet and social media, including gaming platforms, to commit, incite, recruit for, fund, and plan attacks. In his August report on terrorist attacks based on xenophobia, racism, and other forms of intolerance, or in the name of religion or belief, the Secretary General notes that the COVID-19 pandemic has significantly exacerbated the threat of terrorist attacks on this basis. This is due to the exploitation by terrorists and other groups of increased online presence and social isolation to grow and diversify their support base, radicalize and recruit new members, as well as expand their reach and influence. As new technologies emerge and become more widely available, member states are confronted with the urgent need to address the multiple and complex challenges they pose. This includes identifying, monitoring, investigating, and prosecuting terrorist activities involving the use of new technologies, as well as tackling terrorist propaganda and online incitement, taken into account the context of different applicable legal frameworks. In all of this, we must consider the broad human rights implications of the use of new technologies in countering terrorism activities. This includes ensuring that counter-terrorism measures are fully compliant with the right to privacy, data protection, freedom of opinion and expression, freedom of association, as well as freedom of religion or belief. Madam Chair, Excellencies, my office works with its partners, including through the United Nations Global Counterterrorism Coordination Compact, to support member states to leverage new technologies for counterterrorism, while also addressing the risks posed by their misuse for terrorist purposes. We do so in three different ways. First, by offering technological solutions such as Go travel software to identify, detect, intercept, and prevent the travel of terrorists and other serious criminals. We are also exploring the development of Go Fintel software to counter the financing of terrorism. These tools support member states to better adapt and respond to the complex challenges of data collection, analysis, and dissemination in counterterrorism. Second, by enhancing the capacities of requesting member states on the application of new technologies for counterterrorism. As a part of these efforts, we provide capacity building support on the use of unmanned aerial systems for monitoring and surveillance, cybersecurity, as well as digital data collection and digital forensics for investigations, prosecution, and adjudication of terrorist offenses. And third, by building upon a vast network of partners to exchange views and promote innovative solutions on responsible use of technologies. In this context, I can mention the second Counterterrorism Week, which my office hosted at the United Nations headquarters in June 2021, which addressed the transformative role of new technologies in countering terrorism, a theme that also featured prominently in the latest 7th review of the United Nations Global Counterterrorist Strategy. Building partnerships for the responsible use of technology also involves producing joint research to inform and shape debates on the use of technology in countering terrorism. Examples of these efforts include 2 reports produced jointly by the United Nations Interregional Crime and Justice Research Institute and my office on the malicious use of artificial intelligence for terrorist purposes and the opportunities that this technology provides in countering terrorism. Furthermore, our partnership with the International Police Criminal Organization resulted in the production of a handbook for law enforcement on the use of the internet and social media for counterterrorism investigations. Moving forward, my office will continue to work with its United Nations and other partners to advance the Secretary General's vision in his report, Our Common Agenda, to address the risks posed by new technologies to peace and security and use its potential for common good. Madam Chair, Excellencies, the growing availability of new and emerging technologies and their increasing and evolving use by terrorist groups result in significant challenges for member states. We must work together with all relevant stakeholders, including governments, local actors, academia, civil society, the private sector, to address and mitigate those risks, while harnessing our capabilities to use such technologies to counter the spread of terrorism and violent extremism conducive to terrorism. I am confident that this special meeting of the Counter-Terrorism Committee, as well as the forthcoming 8th review of the United Nations Global Counter-Terrorist Strategy, will provide further directions in this regard. UNOST will continue to work closely with the Security Council Counter-Terrorist Committee and member states to promote the coordinated, human rights compliant and gender-sensitive use of new and emerging technologies to prevent and counter terrorism. I thank you.
I thank USG Voronkov for his remarks and overview, and we now will view a video recording from Under-Secretary General Amandeep Singh Gill, the United Nations Secretary General's Envoy on Technology. May we have the video, please?
Good afternoon. It's a pleasure to participate in the special meeting of the Counter-Terrorism Committee Executive Directorate on countering the use of new and emerging technologies for terrorism. I want to take a moment to remember the victims of the terrorist attacks in Mumbai in November 2008. Their memory inspires us, encourages us to be even more vigilant and more focused on countering terrorism. At the Office of the Envoy on Technology, we are taking a holistic look at digital technologies, both the dark side as well as the opportunities. While we are primarily focused on digital technologies, their intersection with other types of technologies is important as well. We are focused on the problem of governance of these technologies, where there is fragmentation of national efforts and efforts across the public and the private sector. We are focused on the opportunity for advancing the SDGs by leveraging the digital transformation. And of course, we are focused on coherence within the UN system. On the issue of counterterrorism, the Office of the Envoy on Technology has a supporting role, because this issue is ably handled by our colleagues from the CTED and the Office of Counterterrorism. There are important linkages in some of the themes and approaches that OSET works on, which might be of interest to member states and other stakeholders and might resonate in this discussion. Let me just address a few. Firstly, why the issue of terrorism is important? Because human lives matter. And if human lives matter, human rights are critical as well. And in particular, the question of how human rights frameworks apply online with regard to balancing freedom of expression, freedom of speech, with protection of individuals from violent crimes and terrorism. The role and responsibility of private companies and digital platforms is critical in this regard. And we need to ensure that there is greater accountability, there is greater transparency, and there is greater collaboration across the public and the private space in upholding human rights and in countering terrorism and the promotion of violence online. There are good examples of this kind of work in the area of counterterrorism with regard to the engagement of private sector firms and online platforms. It's useful to remember the coalitions that have come together after the Christchurch attacks, and also the coalition of private companies that's grouped together in the Global Internet Forum on Countering Terrorism. There are lessons learned, there are best practices when it comes to addressing the use of online platforms for terrorism. There are also interesting possibilities to leverage technology when it comes to surveillance. However, again, this is something that needs to be done in full respect of international human rights law and national and constitutional regimes with regard to the protection of individuals. In other words, we need to balance valid national security concerns with the concerns related to individual freedoms and fundamental human rights. The role of the civil society is very important in this regard, in addition to the existing and important roles of the public and the private sector. I mentioned the Christchurch call and the GIFCT, which is a coalition of the private sector. I think it's important to work on the interface between these coalitions and intergovernmental organizations such as the CTED and other organizations within the UN system. An important area where there are potential opportunities for quick action, for collaboration, is capacity building on counterterrorism and emerging technologies. There is a broader effort on cybersecurity capacity development, which is handled in various UN processes, but this is a key part of our work as well, given our efforts to promote a more holistic, joined-up approach to digital capacity building within the UN system, particularly if we are to ensure that digital plays its due role as an enabler of the sustainable development goals. I want to conclude by focusing for a few minutes on some of the issues that you would be taking up today, for instance, terrorist financing, as well as unmanned aerial systems. There are burgeoning systems of payments online. This is playing a crucial role in economic growth, in inclusion, particularly in developing countries, bringing in women and rural communities into the mainstream economy. So innovation is important here, scale is important, inclusion is important, but at the same time, this is a headache for those who are monitoring these transactions for signs of risk. Digital technologies such as artificial intelligence can play a role and help public authorities maintain the right balance between innovation and surveillance with regard to the terrorist threat. Likewise, unmanned aerial systems are going to be a crucial component in the emerging digital economy. Their regulation, their governance has to take into account the innovation possibilities and the growth potential. At the same time, we need to make sure that these systems are not misused, particularly for WMD terrorism type of attacks. This was a concern that was taken up during the Nuclear Security Summit process, and we need to ensure that in the relevant multilateral forums there is continued attention on how to regulate the unmanned aerial services domain so that we can balance the economic growth opportunity, the innovation opportunity with valid concerns on terrorism. Thank you so much for your attention to my remarks, and I wish the deliberations at this important meeting all success.
I thank the Under-Secretary General for his remarks, and I now have the pleasure to give the floor to Mr. Vikshong Chan, Acting Executive Director of the Counter-Terrorism Committee Executive Directorate, to deliver his remarks. You have the floor.
Thank you, Madam Chair, Excellencies, distinguished participants. I wish to sincerely thank the Government of India for hosting the Counterterrorism Committee's special meeting. I also wish to commend India for its leadership role and also the significant contribution as a member of the Security Council and also as the chair of the committee. The special meeting comes at the right time and for the right topics. 20 years ago, the Security Council decided that all states should deny safe haven to those who finance, plan, support, or commit terrorist acts, or provide safe haven. However, we have witnessed a shift in the nature of terrorist attacks over the years. Today, terrorists consider the digital sphere as a safe haven. Terrorists are skilled at using new platforms and systems for many purposes, including to incite, recruit, finance, plan, and execute terrorist attacks. Terrorists are also increasingly exploiting the chat, gaming, and audiovisual platforms. They understand cybersecurity and take measures to shield their illegal activities. The dark web serves as a marketplace for materials, weapons, and fake documents. In this regard, how we develop and deploy the technology will determine how effectively we shall be able to tackle the new and emerging threats and which are threats to international peace and security caused by terrorist acts. Member states are increasingly deploying technological developments in areas such as artificial intelligence and big data to prevent terrorist acts and to bring terrorists to justice. Both public and private sectors are experimenting with new technologies to improve the traceability of financial transactions. And small and large technology companies are investing in and also deploying AI to detect terrorist content on their platforms. A CETAT-led initiative, Tech Against Terrorism, has also identified over 200 platforms actively used by terrorist groups. Unmanned aerial systems are one of those technologies. As the UAS industry continues to innovate, it is lowering the terrorist barrier to enter into the aerial sphere. The rapid improvements in UAS technology and its increasingly capabilities will provide terrorist groups with multiple new targets. Critical infrastructure, open public spaces, or the other so-called soft targets are uniquely vulnerable to attack. Excellencies, distinguished participants, the global financial technology sector is another growing concern at the exploitation of new financial technology for terrorist purposes. Terrorists and terrorist groups fundraise through crowdfunding platforms and appeals on social media, move and store and storefronts through mobile payment systems, online exchanges, and wallets or privacy coins. Virtual assets, along with other emerging financial technologies, may be vulnerable to abuse by terrorist financiers. These risks are compounded by the increase in the number and types of virtual asset service providers and persisting gaps in their regulation and supervision. These platforms and techniques are considering legal, regulatory, and investigating challenges. Excellencies, distinguished participants, the threat posed to international peace and security by terrorist groups and cells remain grave and continue to grow. How could the international community respond most effectively? First, our understanding, capabilities, and responses must keep pace with the identified threats. CITED remains committed to stay ahead of the technology curve. We have and will continue to support the Security Council and the Counterterrorism Committee in addressing emerging ICT challenges in the context of maintaining international peace and security and in counterterrorism. Strengthen our own assessment work, analysis, and technical expertise and guidance. The launch of the CITED UNODC Practical Guide on Obtaining Electronic Data Across Borders in 2019 is one such example. Enhanced partnership with the UN Office of Counterterrorism under the distinct leadership of Undersecretary USG Voronkov and also the other UN entities under the Global Compact and international and regional organizations and arrangements in raising the awareness of the threat by the misuse of ICT for terrorism purposes and facilitation of the delivery of technical assistance to member states in need. Contribute to innovative initiatives such as the GIFCT and Tech Against Terrorism, as well as the work of the GCTF, as evidenced by CITED's contributions to the Berlin Memorandum of Good Practices for countering terrorist use of unmanned aerial systems. Second, regulations and innovation are complementary and mutually reinforcing. As social media, UAS, and new payment technologies continue their rapid development, our legislation and regulations will need to keep pace. Third, we must continue to identify, share, and also build expertise and technical resources and capacity. Law enforcement agencies have made great strides in the ability to investigate, detect, and disrupt the use of new and emerging technologies for terrorist purposes. Further targeting, training, and capacity building will be required to ensure that criminal justice officials can effectively investigate and, as appropriate, prosecute and adjudicate, technology-related terrorist crimes. Fourth, a multi-stakeholder approach is essential. The Security Council has long noted the importance of developing public-private partnership in efforts to counter acts of terrorism. Today's special meeting provides an ideal opportunity to harness the knowledge, expertise, and support of international and regional organizations, the private sector, civil society, and academia. Fifth, we must remember that new technologies are not a panacea. They must be deployed responsibly with respect for human rights, privacy, and ethical standards. And they must also be grounded in transparency and robust accountability. Excellencies, distinguished participants, as we consider the challenges and opportunities posed by new and emerging technologies, it is essential that we remain committed to further enhancing our coordination, collaboration, and cooperation in order to mount an effective global response. CETAD stands ready to assist member states, the Security Council, the Committee, and other UN entities, and international and regional partners towards that end. Thank you, Madam Chair.
I thank Mr. Chand for his remarks. This concludes the opening plenary segment of today's meeting. I would now like to pause for a few minutes and invite all the dignitaries who spoke at the opening session for a photograph before going on to our next agenda item.